Thanks, Hila, for that introduction. I'll just see if I can share my screen, everybody. Hopefully this goes smoothly. Anyone can let me know if they can see this coming up.
Yeah, you're good.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, so as I say, thanks so much, Tila, for that introduction, and many thanks for the invitation to speak today and reflect on the role of youth work for children in conflict with the law. As Tila mentioned, I'm one of the researchers at the Children and Young People Centre for Justice. Before that, again, as was mentioned, was the Youth Justice Specialist for Unicef UK. So it goes without saying then that, I have a long-standing interest in advocating for the rights of children in conflict with the law, as I know will also be reflected in the knowledge and expertise in this audience. I think we probably all share a common goal in that respect. So I thought it'd be worth briefly reiterating to begin with our vision at CYCJ, as I believe it possesses much synergy with the title and the theme of this convention, which I fully support and wholeheartedly welcome. So the Children and Young People Centre for Justice works towards ensuring that Scotland's approach to children and young people in conflict with the law is rights respecting, contributing to better outcomes for our children, young people and communities. So really advocating for a rights respecting approach for children in conflict with the law is central to all that we do, and essentially is the cornerstone of all our work streams, as many of you will know, whether that be via our participation and engagement work stream, whether that be via practice and policy development, or in my own area of research. We really try and keep the emphasis on that rights respecting, rights-based approach, and really, I suppose, elevating and amplifying the voice of the child, particularly as they're in conflict with the law. So to talk a little bit, I think, and to move on to maybe the main focus of my input today, and I'll keep my remarks very brief. So considering the role of youth work for children in conflict with the law, I think it's important to begin by very briefly considering some of the historical relationship between youth work and youth justice. I think it's important to maybe set that ground of what's happened potentially, in the past. And I think it's be fair to say that this relationship hasn't always been uncomplicated, and assertive integrative tensions may have been evident at times over the years. In part, I think it hasn't always been a simple task to incorporate accessible and universal youth work practice and provision within, at times, a more authoritarian and punitive focused youth justice system. And I think this was perhaps in recent times most discernible in the period that I suppose, academics such as Barry Goldson have referred to in England and Wales as new youth justice. And if any of you have sort of read Barry's book, it kind of gives a really, I think, interesting overview of that period and New Labour in England and Wales, and some of those tensions. And so I think these quotes may be evidence or offer a window into some of those philosophical tensions between fitting youth work practice into what at times, not always, but at times has been, I would say, a deficit-focused youth justice system in terms of its philosophy and in terms of its emphasis on processes. And so Barry Goldson in the New Youth Justice writes, the new interventionism is distinctive. It is an interventionism which promotes prosecution, violates rights, and in the final analysis will only serve to criminalize the most structurally vulnerable children. Former colleagues of mine, Stephen Case and Kevin Haynes, have written again of this period in England and Wales in terms of the new youth justice. The expansionist zeal of the new youth justice has been ineffective systemically and actively harmful individually by drawing increasing numbers of children into the formal system, labeling them as risky and visiting often punitive interventions upon them in order to serve a negative deficit-based objectives. And as I say, I think those two quotes provide an interesting window on sometimes the approach that has taken place within youth justice practice, and that kind of philosophical tension between maybe youth work and welfare and that side of things, and then, you know, placed against some of these other aims that have come out through youth justice systems and practice. I think it is worth highlighting that in relation to England and Wales, there has been movements lately around child first rights-based approaches being incorporated by the Youth Justice Board into their practice. And I think that is important to mention. But I think in terms of setting the scene, that's an interesting dynamic that we have seen traditionally, and, you know, it can't be ignored. I think it's an important dynamic. And I think Conroy sums this up quite accurately, saying that participation in youth justice system programs has often been seen as an unwanted and unnecessary departure from a welfarist approach. Its punitive and targeted nature undermines the youth work profession's core commitment to open access, youth work, voluntary engagement, and provision of universally accessible, non-stigmatizing facilities. So I think that quote sums up maybe this inherent tension philosophically quite well between youth work and youth justice approaches. I think, you know, moving obviously on to the focus on Scotland, I do believe that the policy and legislative journey that has been embarked upon all the way back from Kilbrandon and its lasting welfare legacy that I think we're also aware of and conscious of, through GIRFEC and its ambition to provide all children, young people and their families with the right support at the right time. And, you know, the justice specific kind of whole systems approach, you know, prioritizing, you know, reduce children's criminalization. I think there is much synergy with the policy development and the philosophical development of youth justice approaches in Scotland with youth work practice. And I think that's important to highlight, and particularly to draw that contrast between what I was saying just now in terms of maybe, you know, what traditionally has happened in youth justice and the way that those tensions are formulated. I think in Scotland, you know, through devolved processes, you know, you might be able to tell from my accent that I'm Welsh, and I think it's sometimes a little bit more tricky in places like Wales because of youth justice not being devolved. I think in Scotland, it's been allowed to maybe chart its own course, as I say, all the way back from Kilbrandon to the present, you know, and I think when that's then supplemented by key pieces of legislation and key reforms, so the age criminal responsibility kind of reform that we've seen doesn't go far enough, but I suppose it is a you know, on the correct pathway, so to speak. There has been upward reform. I think when you look at the UNCRC Incorporation Scotland Bill and the wider consultations around reforming the youth justice system that are currently ongoing within the Children's Care and Justice Bill, you know, and many of us, you know, will have read through in detail the consultation proposals earlier in the year. I think, as I say, there is a journey that Scotland's on, and I think there is synergy and there's potential for youth work practice, youth justice to really have that synergy, as I say, in a I suppose, a philosophical sense. With that being said, I do want to make the point, as you're probably not surprised, that I don't want to offer a simple caricature of youth justice system in Scotland and sort of make out that at the moment we're getting everything right and that it's rights respecting in every area. We know that isn't the case. On my Unicef report, a rights-based analysis of youth justice in the United Kingdom, I've drawn attention to you know, some of these failings. As well, Claire Lightoller in her influential report has spent time looking at the Scottish youth justice system, and again has given key attention to some of these rights respecting failings and areas that need to be improved in the Scottish youth justice system. As well, I noticed as well, as well that Bruce was speaking earlier, and I think the Children and Young People's Commissioner's Office have done a lot of really important work again about highlighting essentially kind of where those failings are, and there are failings currently within the system in Scotland, and we all know that. But overall and ultimately, I do believe there is potential in Scotland's philosophical approach to children conflict with the law for integrative youth work and youth justice practice to become an even stronger force than it already is, particularly in future years. And also as we see some of this legislation going through in relation to particularly, the youth justice system, children's hearings, age criminal responsibility, and so on. So philosophy, policy, and legislative developments are, of course, important considerations within any country. But we know that ultimately children's views and their voices should be at the heart of everything we do as a nation and everything we do as professionals and as organizations. We know, I don't need to reiterate this, but we know that Article 12 says, and also with the kind of incorporation bill that hopefully will come into fruition soon, the state party shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child, the views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. And that really, as I say, is the cornerstone. That's the foundation of a lot of, I believe, what youth justice practice should be, but also youth work practice and domestic policy and legislation in this area. So we have this uniting, I suppose, map or guide to how we should approach some of these issues. So what do children actually think about youth work, and particularly as it relates to youth justice? Well, I just want to briefly just give a couple of, I suppose, sources of where we've seen this, and there are many more that you'll all be aware of. But in April and May 2019, 116 young people responded to an online survey to tell Scottish Youth Parliament how youth work has changed lives. And significantly, young people made the connection between the value of youth work and its impact on youth crime, as well as many other benefits, which I'm sure today, many of these have already been explained and highlighted. And some of these videos I've seen have been brilliant, with the children and the young people speaking themselves around kind of the impact, just that video just now around COVID and the impact that youth work has made. But just to, highlight, as you can see, there would be nothing for our young people to do. There would probably be more people hanging out in the streets and engaging in dangerous activities. Knife crime used to be a huge issue in my hometown. Thankfully, many more youth work groups and teams have been set up, and a dramatic fall in knife crime has happened over the past few years. Young people would find other ways to entertain themselves, such as underage drinking. Those are just a couple of examples. But I think really important to help highlight the value of youth work and how that, again, that synergy and that the importance of it for youth work practice, youth crime prevention, all these different areas, early intervention, effective intervention with children, young people who maybe are in conflict with the law or are engaged in the youth justice system. This was also a theme reflected by one of the members of Youth Justice Voices, a Scotland wide participation project jointly run by staff and ourselves at CYCJ, which seeks to amplify the voices of care and justice experienced young people to influence national change. So this is just one quote that I picked out from some research that was done. Every Friday you would have everyone go and play pool, hang about, then it just stopped, lost its funding. You have nothing to do, so you get up to no good. And really it's just highlighting that provision gap, I think, in local communities when youth work isn't there or when it suddenly stops. And as I say, I think it's such a crucial part of the approach to engaging with children in conflict with the law, and as hopefully this section has explained, it's not just coming from a policy point of view. It's not just coming from international children's rights standards, although they're incredibly important in terms of the UNCRC and UK concluding observations and general comments from the United Nations. It's actually coming from young people themselves about how important youth work is when it comes to engaging with children in conflict with the law, when it comes to those aspects of, as I say, youth crime and youth crime prevention. But we know, and I think this is really important to highlight, and I'm sure it's been highlighted already many times, but children are telling us the value of youth work, and notably how that relates to youth justice. Worryingly, however, we are seeing youth work budgets and resources being cut across the UK, as evidenced, I think, in this Unison report, which is probably widely read amongst yourselves in the audience. Unison's report, Youth Services at Breaking Point, I think there's been a figure kind of put around that, on 11.5 million cut in local authority youth service spending in Scotland between 2016 and 19. And we're seeing, across the UK, but obviously, in Scotland as well, this downward trend of youth work budgets being cut down to nothing, essentially, in many communities. And I think that tension there, is brought into stark contrast between what young people are telling us and then the reality of what that provision is for them at a local level. And then, as I say, that relationship as it relates to offending by children and young people. And I think it's important, as we all know, to mention as well that, many of the children who come into conflict with the law have experienced, levels of trauma. They've experienced, many adverse childhood experiences. They've experienced, deprivation, many of these factors. And then we see that essentially in this current context, that provision is shrinking locally in terms of youth work and youth service budget. So I think there is definitely kind of a worrying trajectory there and a concerning trajectory. I just wanted to highlight this Youth Scotland Acting on Poverty report as well. I think at this moment, the current context is perhaps as difficult as it's been in recent times. We know that around 1 in 4 children in Scotland are living in poverty. Scotland's worst affected communities have been faced with the impact of UK-wide austerity and cuts. We've had the global COVID-19 pandemic, which the video just referenced, and now we've got this cost of living crisis on top of everything. Just this week as well, we've also seen the report of the Children's Commission in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, which I think Bruce will most likely have mentioned, in which child poverty, again, is a key cause for concern identified by the Children's Commissioners across the UK. And again, I think, this, in the manifesto to support Scotland's youth workers and young people by YouthLink Scotland, if Scotland truly aspires to be the best place in the world to grow up, then youth work is an essential partner in making this happen. We need to ensure that funds are in place to deliver this for all our young people, including workforce development and support for volunteers. We are asking all political parties to commit to increasing investment in the youth work sector at Scottish Government and local authority level. And so I think, obviously, we need to think of that in terms of this presentation in light of the impacts and the benefits for children and young people in conflict with the law, which again, I think the evidence shows there's many. And in terms of incorporation, Article 12, again, I think we know from children and young people how much they value youth work, particularly, in their local communities, and those connections, those trusted adults, those sources of knowledge and experience that they can go to and develop skills and qualifications and engage, build those relationships. So just very finally, I think better together, and by that I mean I think youth work and youth justice, work together for those shared aims, about not criminalizing children and young people, about respecting their rights, about moving forward, I think in partnership as professionals and that interagency working. I think that's so important, because otherwise, how are we going to meet the deep-rooted, complex and holistic needs encountered by children and young people in conflict with the law? As I say, it goes without saying that it needs to be underpinned by child's rights, child first philosophy. And I think really when that happens, and it is happening in many areas, don't get me wrong, but I think as we further kind of solidify that, but as I say, resources and everything comes into this area, but I think that's when the best interests of the child are really being seen as a primary consideration and a primary right, as we see in the UNCRC. So that's just a little kind of input from myself around maybe youth work and youth justice there.